couple years ago, I was renting a duplex on the edge of town, and when I say the edge, I mean my backyard literally ended where the woods began. It was a super cheap place, which was exactly what I needed at the time, since I was trying to save some money. At the time, I was working the night shift at a warehouse, so my schedule was also backwards. I'd sleep during the day and be awake all night, even on my days off. It could get lonely, but I honestly liked the quiet. My neighbor in the other half of the duplex was this older guy who never seemed to be at home, so it usually felt like I had the whole property to myself. Being on my own like that was great, until it wasn't. It all started on a rainy Tuesday night. I wasn't working that night, so I was just sitting in my living room, playing some video games, when at around 2 a.m., out of nowhere, someone starts pounding on my door. I just sat there for a second, trying to process what was happening. Nobody ever came out this far, especially not at 2 in the morning, in the pouring rain. I crept up the door and looked through the peephole. The porch light was busted, but I could make out the silhouette of someone tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. He was completely soaked. I didn't want to open the door for obvious reasons, so I just asked him what he wanted through the door. He said his car had broken down about a mile up the road, and his phone was dead. He asked if I had any jumper cables and if I could drive him back up to his car to give him a jump. I instantly got a bad feeling, so I told him my car was in the shop and I couldn't help him. Then he asks if he could just come inside out of the rain for a few minutes, use my phone to call a tow truck. I wasn't going to let some random guy into my house at 2 a.m., so I told him no. But I offered to call a tow truck for him if he gave me his information. The guy went silent. He just stood there, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he mumbles something about never minding and just turns around and walks away. I went to the front window and watched him walk down the driveway. He didn't head back up the main road where he claimed his car was. Instead, he walks toward the dead end of our street and disappears into the tree line. I stayed up the rest of the night, but he never came back. After a couple days, I'd brushed off the encounter, thinking it was probably just some weird drifter. But then Friday night rolls around. I was off work again, making some food in the kitchen, around 1 a.m. The kitchen had a sliding glass door that led out to the backyard. I had the blinds drawn, but I could hear the rain starting to pick up outside. And then I heard a tapping on the glass. It wasn't a loud knock like at the front door. It was a slow tapping like a single finger on the glass. I froze. The backyard was fenced off by a 6-foot fence, and the only way back there was through a wooden gate that I always kept shut. I turned off the kitchen light so whoever was out there couldn't see in, and I slowly walk over to the blinds. I peek out. It was the same guy. He was standing maybe 2 feet away from the glass, drenched in rain, looking directly at the spot where I was peeking out. It was like he knew where I was. He taps again and asks in a really calm, almost friendly voice if I could let him in out of the rain. I didn't say a word, just backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911. I back all the way up out into the hallway and whispered to the dispatcher that there was an intruder in my backyard. And while I was on the phone, the tapping stops. I hear the wet squelch of footsteps in the mud, moving away from the door. By the time the cops show up, the guy's long gone. They shine their flashlights all over the backyard and show me where the muddy footprints led straight to the back of the fence. The guy had vaulted over the fence to get back into the woods. The cops took a report and suggested I get some cameras and make sure my locks were secure. So the next morning I bought 3 of those cheap, motion-activated cameras. I put one in the front window, one pointing at the back, and one in my bedroom that faced the side yard. I spent the next few nights constantly checking my phone, completely paranoid. A whole week goes by, and nothing happens. I start to relax a bit, thinking the guy had moved on or gotten arrested somewhere else. But on a Wednesday morning, I wake up and check my phone and find a notification on the camera in my bedroom window. It said motion detected at 3:14 a.m. I open the app and play the clip. For the first few seconds there's nothing, but then a figure slowly steps into the frame from the direction of the woods. It was him. He walks right up to my bedroom and just stands there staring into my window for almost 20 minutes. And then right before the clip ends, he reaches up and gently tests the window screen, pushing against it to see if it was loose. It wasn't, so he just turns around and walks back into the trees. Watching that footage made me feel physically ill. He'd been standing right outside my bedroom while I was sleeping. I called the cops again and showed them the video. They took it more seriously this time and told me they'd set up extra patrols, but they still didn't know who the guy was. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore, so I broke my lease and started packing. I planned to move to a friend's place across town by the weekend. I just had to survive 2 more nights in that house. Thursday night, I lock every door, check every window, and then I just sit in my living room with a baseball bat sitting on the couch beside me. At around 2:30, I hear the click of the side gate. I grab the bat and immediately call 911. I told the dispatcher the stalker was back and that I was hiding inside. I could hear footsteps crunching through the wet grass, moving slowly toward the back of the house. Then I heard him at the sliding glass door, but this time he didn't knock. He didn't tap. Instead, I hear the sound of metal scraping against metal. He was trying to pry the sliding door open. The dispatcher told me that officers were already on the way and to stay exactly where I was. The scraping continues for a few agonizing minutes and then I hear a sharp crack. He hadn't managed to pick the lock, so he decided to break through the glass instead. I stood in the kitchen, gripping that bat hard like my life depended on it. And right at that moment, the front yard lights up, flashing red and blue lights of squad cars pulling into my driveway. I heard the guy scramble back away from the door, but the cops had surrounded the property. They caught him halfway up the back fence, trying to escape into the woods. When I went out, they had the guy in handcuffs, sitting on the curb. He glares at me with pure hatred. The scariest part wasn't even the break-in. It was what the cops found in the guy's bag. He had a hammer, a roll of duct tape, zip ties, and a hunting knife. The detective told me the guy probably wasn't just a burglar. He'd been testing my boundaries, seeing if I was gullible enough to let him in, and when that didn't work, he decided to find the best point of entry for himself. If the cops had come any later, well, I'm not sure I'd still be here to tell this story. I was in my junior year of college when this happened. Me and a couple of buddies had just moved into this rental just off campus. It was me, my friend Mark, and another guy named Dave. The house had high ceilings and one of those square panels in the hallway, leading into a crawl space in the roof. We never went up there because, well, honestly, we just never thought to. For the first couple months, everything was completely normal, but right around October, leading up to Halloween, we started noticing some weird stuff. Mostly it was just noises. Late at night, when the house was quiet, we'd hear faint tapping or scraping coming from above us. It usually happened right over my bedroom or the living room. We wrote it off as raccoons or rats or something. The house was old, so it made sense. We texted our landlord about getting an exterminator out there, but he was a cheapskate and kept blowing us off. A few days before Halloween, the noises got louder, and it wasn't just faint scratching anymore. One night, while I was studying at my desk, I heard what sounded like a heavy box being dragged across the floorboards directly above my head. I remember texting Mark, who was in his room across the hall, asking if he'd heard it too. He texted back saying it was probably just the wind. That seemed like a stretch, but I kind of just forced myself to believe it at the time so I could get some sleep. Not the smartest decision, I know. Anyway, Halloween rolls around. Dave ended up going to a frat party and told us he was just going to crash at his girlfriend's place afterward. Mark and I stayed in, handed out some cheap candy for a couple hours, and then just played video games in the living room. At about 2 a.m., we were both exhausted, so we called it a night and I went to bed. I think it was maybe around 3:30 when I woke up. I was super thirsty and needed to grab a bottle of water from the kitchen. The house was dead quiet. I roll out of bed, open my door, and step out into the hallway. The only light was coming from a street lamp, shining through the front window. I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like the fridge door opening, followed by the sound of glass clinking. My first thought was that Dave had come home. I walked towards the kitchen, rubbing my eyes, and asked Dave how the party was. But when I turned the corner into the kitchen, it wasn't Dave. Standing in front of the open fridge was a man I'd never seen before. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing very dirty clothes, and his hair was long, and even dirtier. He was holding a jar of peanut butter and was just scooping it out with his hands. Now, I'd like to tell you that I confronted the man and chased him out of the house, but honestly, I just froze in the doorway, staring at him. He didn't even flinch when I walked in. He just slowly turns his head, looks right at me, and keeps eating. I slowly back into the hallway, then turned and ran into Mark's room. I threw his door open and shook him awake. I whispered frantically that there was a strange guy in our kitchen. Mark shot up, wide awake. He grabs a heavy metal flashlight he keeps under his bed, and we creep back down the hallway together. The guy was still in the kitchen, but now he was sitting at the dining table. Mark shines the flashlight right in his face and yells at him, demanding to know who he was and how he got in. The man didn't run. He didn't even look scared. He just shields his eyes from the light and angrily tells us to turn it off. In his slurred speech, he tells us he lives there and that he'd been paying rent to the landlord. He demanded to know what we were doing in his house. Mark told him he was crazy and that we were the ones renting the place, and told the guy that we'd be calling the cops, and that completely set him off. He stands up from the table, knocking his chair over, and starts screaming back at us. Just crazy, borderline, incoherent stuff. He said that we were the ones trespassing and reached over the counter and grabs a heavy kitchen knife sitting by the sink. He points it at us and tells us we have 5 seconds to pack our stuff and get out of his house. We didn't wait around to see what he'd do. We both bolted for the front door, practically tripping over each other to get out. We ran out into the freezing cold in bare feet and hopped into Mark's car, which was parked on the side of the street. And then we called 911. We locked the doors and just watched the front of the house, terrified the guy was going to come running out with that knife. The cops showed up about 10 minutes later. We gave them the keys and watched as the officers went inside. They were in there for a while before one of them finally comes back out and talks to us. He told us the guy was gone. He'd apparently smashed the back window in the laundry room and hopped the fence. But the cop told us we needed to come inside and see something. They took us into the hallway and pointed up at the open panel in the crawl space. The officers had gone up there to clear it, and what they found was just completely insane. The guy hadn't just broken in that night. He'd been living up there the whole time. The cops brought down a ladder and let us peek up into the crawl space. There was a filthy sleeping bag, a bucket he was using as a toilet, and dozens of empty food wrappers and drink bottles. But the worst part was what he'd done to the floorboards up there. It still keeps me up at night. The cops showed us 3 small holes drilled through the ceiling. One was directly over the bathroom shower, another was over Mark's bed, and the last one was perfectly positioned, looking down right onto my bed. When we'd been hearing those weird tapping and scratching noises all month, it wasn't rats or raccoons. It was him, crawling around on his hands and knees in the dark, watching us. We never slept in that house again. The police never ended up catching the guy. And every time I think about how long he was up there, just watching us, I feel sick to my stomach. Back in my sophomore year of college, my younger sister and I were renting this really rundown farmhouse a few miles outside of town. It was basically in the middle of nowhere, upstate New York, surrounded by acres of empty fields and thick woods. Our older brother was supposed to move in with us and take the 3rd bedroom, but his job transferred him out of state at the last minute, so it was just the 2 of us girls. The house was super drafty and always felt a little too big and a little too quiet at night. This happened during a massive winter storm around late January. It had been snowing heavily for almost 2 days straight, and the roads were completely covered. We were snowed in, but we didn't really mind. We had plenty of groceries, and we were just hanging out in the living room watching movies. But right around 10 p.m. one night, the wind really picked up, and we heard a loud pop coming from outside. The power instantly cut out, plunging the entire house into darkness. We grabbed some flashlights and bundled up in blankets on the couch, waiting to see if it would come back on. After about an hour, it was getting freezing inside. I got up to look out the front window to see if any of the houses down the main road had their lights back on, and that's when I saw him. Standing at the end of our driveway was a man. He was wearing this oversized, orange hunting jacket. It was the only thing you could clearly make out in the dark against all the snow. He wasn't walking past. He was just standing there, facing our house. I called my sister over and we stood at the window, starting to get a little creeped out. We were out in the country, the roads were blocked, and there was no reason for anyone to be out walking in this kind of weather. And then he starts marching up our driveway. He's trudging through knee-deep snow, making a beeline straight for our front porch. My sister panics and runs to make sure the door's locked. By the time I back away from the window, the guy's already on the porch. He immediately starts pounding on the door, shouting. I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying through the thick wood and the howling wind, but his voice was super aggressive. He sounded furious. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my stomach sank when I saw I had no signal. And since the power was out, our Wi-Fi was dead too. We had no landline. Then the guy starts just like throwing his entire body against the door. The door's shaking in its frame. My sister starts to cry. I grab her hand and we run into the coat closet beneath the stairs. We shut the door and curl up on the floor and just held on to each other. We sat there in the dark, listening to him scream and beat on the door. He kept yelling that he knew we were in there and demanding that we open up. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, just waiting for the sound of the door crashing open, knowing nobody was coming to save us. But after maybe 15, 20 minutes, it just stopped. The house went dead silent. We were too scared to leave the closet, so we just sat there the rest of the night, freezing and scared out of our minds. When the sun finally came up, we crept out and looked out the window. He was gone. The snow had covered his tracks, so we'd no idea which way he went. The power came back on a few hours later, and we immediately called the cops. They drove out and took a report, but because we couldn't give a clear description of the guy, other than the fact he was wearing an orange jacket, it seemed like there wasn't much they could do. We were super paranoid for a couple weeks, but eventually we kind of let our guard down. The snow melted, classes started getting busy, and we just kind of fell back into the routine of normal life. One morning, about a month later, I woke up around 6 o'clock because my room was freezing. I threw on a sweater and walked downstairs to turn up the heat, but when I got to the bottom of the stairs, I felt a freezing draft coming from the back of the house. So I walk into the kitchen to check it out, and I see the back doors just standing wide open. The glass pane near the handle had been shattered, and shards were all over the floor. Someone had broken in while we were asleep. I screamed for my sister, and we ran out the front door and called the cops from the driveway. The cops arrived and cleared the house, and they came out and told us we'd been robbed. Our laptops were missing from the living room, also a decent amount of cash we had in the kitchen. But the part that still gives me crippling anxiety was what happened in my bedroom. I had this antique wooden jewelry box that my grandmother had given me. It was bulky and solid wood, and it sat on my bedside table, literally inches from my pillow. That was gone. They'd taken it. Whoever broke into our house had been in my bedroom while I was asleep. The police never caught the guy who broke in, and I still have no idea if the angry guy in the orange jacket was the same guy or if it was all just a coincidence. I guess I'll never know.